You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it the wrong way.
This is Play-by-Playcast, the world's #1 sports media podcast. Wait, what?
Nobody's fact-checking it. Just keep going.
Here we go.
Who the hell is Happy Gilmore?
Got all that on camera, right, John?
Sure, I did.
All right, because the red light was not on.
The podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster.
Oh, you can stick me in some kind of Italian boat because that one is gondola.
Now, from New York, really?
All the big ones are from New York.
Your host, Joe Godet.
It's still Joel.
Yeah, he will not be able to see very well, Cotton. Here we go.
Hey, it's Friday morning, which means it's another time for Play-by-Playcast. Thanks as always for the subscribe, the stream, the download, however you have found this here podcast. My name is Joel Godet. It is Play-by-Playcast, the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by one, a professional development podcast that dives into the tips, tricks, experience, stories, process, and preparation of some of the biggest and best play-by-play announcers in the business on social media at PXPcast or at Joel Godet. Email me, jgodett at bsu.edu. Our guest today, since 1990, has been on the broadcast team, and for the overwhelming majority of that time, he has been the voice of the team with the Des Moines, Iowa Cubs, Deane Ehlis, who cut back his schedule a couple of years ago, but has been a staple of the American Association first, and then the Pacific Coast League for the better part of the last 30 years. We'll get to Deane here in a second, but minor league baseball guest this week, baseball guest next week. A lot of baseball. It's baseball season. So for those of you in the minors, maybe listening to this on a bus right now, you're in the thick of, your job. This is what you guys all live for. When you're on the college side, this is the downtime of year. And I don't know what to do with myself sometimes when we get to this time of year. That's how this podcast was born. Out of boredom, because I had no games to call. I started a podcast 3 years ago. This past weekend was the first weekend in which I had no games to broadcast. I don't want to say that definitively, because maybe there was another one. But certainly I had no games to broadcast or prep for. First time since August of last year. Like, long run there. But I didn't plan it out ahead of time. Like life goes on. You just yada, yada, yada. You go day by day. And I get to last weekend, and I suddenly had nothing to do. Like, I'm not going to go into work. I could. I'd be the only one there. And I had no games to call. So, okay. I literally, on Saturday morning last week, having just realized I had made no plans for my newfound freedom, I woke up and went to the gym on Saturday morning, and then I got home and I binge-watched The Americans. I plopped down on my sofa and did not move until about 2 in the morning, at which point I went to bed and woke up and played opening day for my slow-pitch softball league, and came home and watched more of The Americans. Like we always say, it'll be nice to have a day off or a weekend off, and then we get one, and I have no earthly idea what to do with it. I just watched Amazon Prime. Like, got through 3 whole seasons of a very good television show, but that mere fact is both impressive, embarrassing, and just downright amazing. That's how I spent my first weekend with nothing to do. This weekend, I do have something to do. Saturday night, tomorrow night, if you're listening to this on time, it's the Indiana High School All-Star Game. Ball State's got a couple kids in that, a guy and a girl. So I'll go shoot some video of them. So that takes care of Saturday night. I got softball on Sunday. No, I don't. I have nothing to do on Sunday. I'll have to make some plans. I might go on a hike somewhere. We'll see. It's like I feel like the character in Pitch Perfect, Bumper, when he gets signed to his record label. It's like, I'm gonna go get a tattoo. I don't know. I forget what else the rest of that line is. I'm not gonna get a tattoo, Mom and Dad. I don't know what to do. We'll think of something. Anyway, let's get to Deane Ehlis. Before we start with Deane, if you are new to the podcast or you did not get a chance to listen to last week's episode, Kevin Harlan was our guest from Westwood One and TNT and CBS. Hands down, one of my favorite episodes, favorite guests of all time. So if you get the opportunity and you've got a half an hour, do click back through last week and listen to that one. You will not be sorry about that at all. Our conversation with Deane Ehlis, though, because he's been doing this for a very long time. He's turning 66 in June. I started with, and he's been in the same place since 1990. I started with how he keeps this fresh and what keeps him coming back to it, energized to bring baseball to Des Moines, and, with the internet to the world, but to the Des Moines Cubs fans on a day-in and day-out basis for 30 years. He is one of the most respected voices in AAA, and this week he is our guest on PXPcast.
I think it all goes back to your childhood and growing up and just loving sports in general, but in particular baseball and, playing the game and just loving to get out there, loving to get outside and play catch and hit the ball and, compete. And you just have that childhood love for the game. And you, like a lot of kids, you're thinking, oh, boy, I want to be a ball player when I grow up and get to the big leagues. And, some like for me, the guys I would see growing up, the Mickey Mantle and Bill Freehand and different players like that, thinking, yeah, I want to do that one day. And then, as you get older into the teenage years, you start to realize that, well, that's probably not going to happen. So you're looking at what else could I do to get involved in sports in general and baseball in particular. And I always thought broadcasting was a good way to do it. And I think it's just the love of the game that keeps you going. And there's tough travel in our league, and I've got a family and a lot of the events I've had to miss family-wise, but it's just that passion you have and the love of baseball that keeps you going from day to day and why you show up. And, of course, the term you hear a lot in baseball, particularly in minor leagues, is grinding it out. And as you get going in the season year after year, you're definitely trying to grind out some of the tougher days that you run into.
You don't get used to the old 4 a.m. flight out of the PCL?
Yes, yeah. We, typically they always want the first flight just in case there's some type of a problem with, a flight canceled or delayed or whatnot, that there's some alternatives. If you leave at noon, theoretically you might get to the place at 3 or 4 o'clock in time to go to the ballpark and go to the game. But many a time, as we know, anybody in traveling these days, there's always a complication. So the first flight out is the one you have to get. That's the league rule. So you might play a night game and be up the next morning at 3:30, 4 o'clock to get to the airport and get on a flight at 6 o'clock, whether you're heading back home or your next destination. And, of course, for the players, I think it's even tougher for them. They've got to go out and physically compete after maybe not having very little sleep or any at all in some cases with a 3 or 4 a.m. wake-up call. And again, you get back to that term of kind of grinding it out and just learning to adapt. It's a tough one. But again, you fall back and you just the same for the players. They love what they're doing and the chance to their career basically playing a game and hopefully get to the big leagues and make a good living up there. But that's what it comes back to, is that love of the game that everybody seems to have.
I feel like you've been doing this too long for the answer to not be affirmative. Have you ever had those complications on flights and issues?
Oh, yeah. There's all kinds of stories of weather delays and canceled flights. And I can remember one, and we made it to Minneapolis, but our connecting flight back to Des Moines, which was always funny because many a time you'd fly somewhere and you'd fly over Des Moines to land in Minneapolis or Chicago and take, that hour flight back home to get there. But we didn't have a flight, so we were renting cars. We were down in New Orleans when Katrina hit, and of course they canceled the games, and we had to get out of town, couldn't get a flight, and fortunately we were able to get a bus, so we had to bus back to Des Moines. And there's almost every year something comes up, and I remember one year we made it, but none of the equipment made it, and they thought they were going to have to cancel the game, but our general manager, we went out to a sporting goods store and bought some gloves and which didn't work out too well. But we had to, you have to make adaptations for sure to try to get the games in.
And we're using aluminum bats today because that's all we could find.
That didn't happen.
What was being in New Orleans around the time of Katrina like? Was that the immediate aftermath of the storm, the immediate before the storm? Was it during it?
Yeah, it was before the storm, and again, I just felt we were fortunate to get out of town to be able to get that bus, and of course, even once you have a bus, it was difficult traveling with. You heard the reports of highways backed up and people lined up on these highways couldn't move, and we had some slow traffic, but overall we made it out of town okay. But it was just before the storm hit, and we sure didn't want to be trapped there because you'd see all the pictures and the flooding and the devastation that happened. But we got out of town just as it was happening, and it was that was one of the more memorable travel endeavors that we had through the years.
You've obviously been in two different leagues since you've been in Des Moines. What trip do you miss most that you no longer get from the American Association?
That's a good question. I like that because the American Association, I enjoyed going to Buffalo, even though it was a longer flight. But it's a nice city, great ballpark, good people there. So I always miss going to Buffalo. But even Indianapolis, especially with their new ballpark, we used to. And Busch Stadium, the old one, was a pretty good place to broadcast the game, and they had good crowds. So that was a good trip. And even more so with their Victory Stadium they have now. We had it, I think, maybe a couple of years in our league before they, broke up the association. So Indianapolis was good. And even Louisville, I liked their old ballpark with, short porch and right field and the artificial surface. And they had, you had to climb stairs to get to the broadcast booth, which doesn't happen too often anymore. But it was a good stop too, because again, they had good crowds and good support. And at that time, I think they were the Cardinal affiliates. So it was fun, kind of that Cub-Cardinal rivalry. Those games are always fun.
The old Busch Stadium in Indianapolis is it's an apartment complex now too. By the way, the field is still there. It's like a wiffle ball field. Yeah,
exactly. I've read articles on that. That's interesting. And Oklahoma City, of course, still in the league, but I think the old ballpark we used to go there, All Sports Stadium, is like a racetrack, go-kart racetrack or something, I believe, or maybe part of it's a parking lot. But things have sure changed. There were some tough ballparks in the old days, but overall, AAA is comparable. At least the ballparks are really nice compared to what they were in the old days. And even some of the hotels that we used to go to were, a little down at times, but that's been upgraded too. And usually we stay at pretty nice places now.
I want to get into a little bit of the philosophy you have on what you do, and I want to start really broad picture and just ask you what makes a good baseball game on the radio to you beyond like the basics of time score and is it a ball, is it a strike? What separates a really quality listen from just something that's out there?
I think you've got to almost have a conversation with, almost think, well, one person is listening, or whether it's one or 100 or thousands, but almost a one-on-one where you're talking with somebody about the game and describing the game, but try to inflect some things about the ballpark or the city or baseball in general, some history of the other team or history of the players, and add some information along with the score is most critical and what's going on. You can't lose track of that. That's definitely number one. But I just think you have to make it as interesting as possible. And as you know, Joel, in any baseball season, big leagues or minor leagues, you're going to have those games or you're losing 10-2, or even if you're ahead 10-2, you have to come up with some things to keep it interesting. And I think that's a big part of it. And I've always approached it where, here in the Midwest, we're competing against the big leagues. We've got, fans love the Cubs, and Pat Hughes is like one of the best in the game, if not the best. And I always approached it as, that for listenership, I'm competing with the Cubs. They can pick up the Cardinals here, the Royals, the Twins fans that are in this area. So I always thought, I've got to do my best to make it sound like a major league broadcast. And again, part of that is just passing along some information that they might not get if they're sitting at the ballpark and watching the game and maybe listening and a little more so than the play-by-play. But of course, again, play-by-play and what's going on in the field is very important.
Obviously, been doing this a long time. What has changed in terms of how people call games now? Like I feel like this is like that. I don't want to make this out to be like old man yells at clouds moment, or like get off my lawn. But like, what is different about the younger broadcasters, and I'll throw myself into that mix, about the way that we approach the game, and broadcasting the game that has evolved over time for better, and potentially, you know, things that you wish people still did a different way?
Social media has become more important as it is in everything, but even before that, early on, we'd have some information on our team and the opposing teams and hitting streaks and some of the basic facts on the team. But now there's just so much more knowledge and more information that you have to prep on and try to integrate it into the broadcast, but not overdo it. I think we can get carried away, a tendency to get carried away with some of the statistics, and especially getting into some of the new terminology with, you know, exit velocity and things like that are interesting, but you have to kind of use it sparingly. And again, think that most of the people listening, I don't know that there's a few that are really knowledgeable baseball fans, but for the most part, they're just the casual baseball fan interested in the team or a certain player. And so I think the bottom line with that question is there's just so much more information. Social media has become important. And again, I think you have to integrate that into the broadcast, but not try to overdo it. And it all goes back to focusing on what's happening out in front of you in the diamond. And again, that goes back to something I said about, you know, going back many years where we didn't have as much information. You would talk more about maybe the city, the ballpark, some of the fans at the game, just the weather conditions. I'm a big one that likes and of course this comes into play now with all the shifts going on, but I was always big into defensive alignments and even trying to notice where outfielders or infielders were shifting depending on the hitter, the pitch count, the pitcher, and just little things like that again, the casual fan, if they happen to be in the ballpark and listening to the game while they're watching the game, things that they can also pick up on. And I always thought too about little kids that, you know, just basic stuff about, you know, chasing pitches out of the zone or whatnot, but anything you could do for some 8 or 10 or 12-year-old listening to the broadcast that might learn something and go out to his little league or high school game and adapt and use that would help him. That was also good too.
That's got to have evolved your prep too, because information is so readily available now, and that's probably one of the knocks on young guys coming up is like, well, they don't talk to enough people. They just, you know, you read articles on the internet and you read stats and you call a game. What did you have to do before you could go into the stats portal and easily pull up what this guy is hitting with runners on base on a Tuesday when it doesn't rain? How did you prepare differently, and how has that helped keep you on top of your game as you know you move forward in your career at this point?
Yeah, there's definitely more knowledge out there with the internet, which is wonderful. I think I've learned more about, especially more so the opposing team, where you just don't know these guys and they're in for 3-4 games, and so you can do some searching in the internet and find some interesting things out. And of course now they'd have in the media guy, they'd have information like that, but a lot of teams have done away with the media guys, but the internet has helped there. But in the old days, I think there was, at least for me, there was more communication with the players and talking to them more about yesterday's game or why they do this or why their hitting stance is that way, and defensively why they're doing some things, or pitching wise, you know, about the pitches they throw and what they threw in that situation. You did more of that than you do now, just because you do have to put some time in my opinion, on the internet and just delving into the daily stats and the information that each team sends out prior to the game. You have to spend more time delving into that because there is some good information there, but you might have to do some digging. So it's still a combination, but I think more so 20, 30 years ago, you would talk more and get more information out of the players, and the coaches were probably more so the coaches and the manager, depending on your relationship with your staff. You get a lot of information out of them about not just in the moves they made, but why this player does that or where he needs to improve and go from there. So it's still a combination of doing those things. But again, I think with all the information we have on the internet and the team notes that come out every day, there's probably more time spent on that than there was many years ago.
I've read you do at least 3 hours of homework for each broadcast. What's that consist of?
Again, this day and age, a lot of it is involved with doing some searches on the internet, or maybe just keeping your ears open and hearing something about a player and trying to investigate that. I still like to follow, each major league team, even if it's in a small way, just to know what's going on in Major League Baseball. Because, again, I think a lot of the people listening are baseball fans in general, and probably more so Major League fans than minor league fans. Their interest in the minor leagues is probably more on individuals and guys coming up, especially if you're a Chicago Cubs fan. You're wondering, who's going to be the next big starting pitcher or the next big prospect, going back to the Baez and Bryant and Schwarber, all the guys we've had in recent seasons, all the interest in them. So they're listening because they're Chicago Cubs fans and they want to know about individuals. So you have to, do some homework there on different individuals. But yeah, you're probably right. It might be just because I'm a baseball fan and in many ways just do things that I typically do because I'm a fan of the game, but following baseball in general and, again, doing some work on the internet and then, batting practice. You talk to the players or during BP or maybe when the pitchers are doing their side work and find out some little things, but sometimes you just see things that they're doing and working on that you can kind of integrate into the broadcast where, man, so-and-so today, and it was really concentrating on going the other way and in batting practice, not thinking about home runs and hit the ball a lot the other way to right field, and then in the game he gets 2 hits over there, and you can combine that in. So in many cases, it's not only maybe talking to the players, but more so just keeping your eyes and ears open and some things you might see during BP and some of the sessions they have before each game.
I was going to say, big batting practice, stand around the cage kind of guy?
Yeah, I do like that. That's a good time to meet the players. I've cut back. I don't travel as much as I used to. That was also a good way to kind of get to know the players, and more so not so much in the baseball context, but also they're just the personal guys. And you'd hear about, I can't really afford to have my wife out here for the season. She's teaching school back home, or, just their personal story was always interesting for me, all the sacrifices they have to make to try to get to the big leagues. And so that was always nice. The travel, I think, was, the negative side were the early wake-up calls and some of the long flights and layovers and delays and whatnot. But the positive was you really could get closer to the players and get to know them a little better. But for me, batting practice is a nice time just to, not a lot, but not overdo it. I think you can kind of overdo it when you're with the players there. But again, just to ask a question or two and observe some things and talk to them around the batting cage. That's more relaxed atmosphere and kind of a casual time.
Tell me a little bit about developing those relationships and how everyone knows what our job is and why we're there for the most part, but how you create that bond where there's a trust in you and you can get to know a person, not just for, hey, Tom, I'm asking this question for information because I want to use it on the air, but I'm asking this question because I'm generally interested in who you are, and I want to create that friendship, for lack of a better word, which then leads to inherently a better broadcast, and particularly at the AAA level where you get so many different personalities, and some guys are angry because they've been sent down, and you get there's a much different blend of personality types as opposed to if you're working with the very much more doe-eyed kind of players in low A or high A.
Yeah, definitely the case, and it's more difficult. I've always been envious, in the big leagues, you're with one team and you just get to know the players because in some cases they're there not just 4 or 5 years, but 8, 10 years, and just there can be a friendship developed there by by that longevity factor. But as you said, and it's even more so in the last few years where guys just aren't in AAA as much as they used to be, where they might spend 1 or 2 years here, or typically a full season at least in AAA before they got the call to the big league. But now they're shuffling guys back and forth, so it's even more difficult. But I think for me, part of what's helped me is, I'm semi-retired now, but I used to work for the team year-round and do sales in the off-season. And I think that helped, where you just learn to be personable and how to communicate with people. And probably number one in sales and maybe number one in the broadcast business is just being a good listener and talking to the guys about, hey, where are you from? And you find out their home, and then you ask them a couple of questions, and they get going. And I think players are most of them are happy to talk about non-baseball subjects and their family and how they grew up and how they fell in love with the game and things like that. So it's just a matter of just be yourself. I think that's part of my upbringing too, was to be friendly and sociable and work with people and just kind of be yourself and talk to them, not so much as a broadcaster doing an interview, but just as one person talking with another and just trying to find out a little bit about them.
Do you have a way to catalog that, per se? Like, not that you would be writing it down as they're telling it to you, but how you make sure that it doesn't all run together or away from your mind after you have those types of conversations?
Not really. There probably should be a way to do that. I have a little book or something just to take a couple of notes. If something really important was involved that related to, I thought would relate to the broadcast, I would do that. But, hopefully your recall is good enough that at least the basic fact that that so-and-so and his wife are expecting and she's back home or whatnot, things like that. Or, he's got 3 brothers back home that he says are better than him. Or I still remember that with Jose Molina was a catcher one year and talking to him about Benji, his older brother, and how good Benji was. He said, Benji and I, we're pretty good. We're doing okay. But I'll tell you, we got another little brother, Yadier, who's going to be better than the both of us. And, I'd mentioned that on the broadcast. And, of course, here we are 20, 25 years later, where Yadier might be a Hall of Famer, and Benji and Jose had good careers, but Jose hit that one on the nose. So again, to answer your question, I don't really have a system to keep track of that, but hopefully your mind is sharp enough to remember at least the most important stuff. And sometimes you just go back and ask the players about it. They'll mention a problem or something going on at home, and you just have to recall that and try to bring it up with them, or, family coming to town. And sometimes you meet the dads and find out a little more, dads or moms find out a little more about the players too.
Where did your style come from? People have said you've got a very calm demeanor, understated style on the air. How did you develop that kind of even keel? I'm sitting in the living room just kind of chilling with you style, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think part of it is the broadcaster I listened to. I didn't really think about this till years later, but the broadcaster I listened to growing up, Herb Carneal. I'm from Montana, and the games we had on the radio were the Minnesota Twins. So it was Herb Carneal, and then Halsey Hall was the sidekick, but Herb did the play-by-play, and he had a real, just factual play-by-play of what's going on. And real calm. You get excited at the right time, but basically just you can, as a listener, would relax and enjoy. You knew what was going on, and he and Halsey were just wonderful partners, just bantering back and forth about baseball, or like I said earlier, a game gets out of hand. They might be talking about, Halsey loved to smoke cigars, so they'd be talking about Halsey and cigars, or some place they ate at, or things away from baseball. But Herb was just, to me, just very smooth and just a nice way to listen to the game and not overhyping anything. And so that was part of it. And again, part of it is just have to be yourself, your personality. That I know some broadcasters are just more hyper, I guess would be the word I would use, compared with me. And so they get a little more fired up about some plays than maybe what I would. But I think you have to be yourself, and then, probably listen to as many broadcasters as you can and adapt your own style. I think also an influence for me was initially in radio. I started out as a disc jockey, and And I kind of got into it, radio business, for the love of music and the love of sports. But initially, disc jockey before they let me do some high school basketball and football games, and eventually I got into minor league baseball. But I think the being a DJ also kind of set my style and my tempo and the delivery that I have. That helped too. So I can't say it's any one thing, but just that combination of factors where you become the broadcaster you are, and you have your own style, and different things appeal to different listeners, and I think that's the case with baseball broadcasters too.
Was a lot of that second nature, or did you do a lot of active listening in terms of trying to pick things away, or was it just that osmosis?
I think it was more the osmosis. I would listen, probably more so being here in the Midwest, and after our games would end, or if we had a day game, probably the game I'd listen to on the radio before the days of the internet, where you can pick up any game now, would be the Chicago Cubs. Going back to whether it's TV or radio, but listening to Kerry and not only his play-by-play, but also just how he and Steve Stone were such a great team together, and the relationship they had, and Chip Kerry with the Cubs and Tom Brenneman and the guys that were very good play-by-play guys. And of course, the last 25 years almost now, just Pat Hughes and listening to him, and he's that same kind of guy for me, at least. It's just an easy listen. He for the most part is casual, very factual, and does a great job for years with working with Juan Santo, and of course now with Ronnie Coomer. They're a real good team. So I can't say I was doing it to try to learn some new things, but just again, as a baseball fan, and I think as you say, osmosis, or subconsciously you pick up some things that you hear from other people and integrate it into the person that you are, and helps with your style.
Well, and I was going to say, it's kind of like it's like the anti-Harry Carey a little bit in some respects.
Yeah. Of course, Harry was, but again, if you go way back, even before my time, if you listen to old tapes of Harry when he was with the Cardinals, man, he was like some of the best play-by-play I've ever heard is Harry. He was right on top of things as far as the play-by-play, and very knowledgeable about the game, and just his voice was so much better when he was young and going with the Cardinals that it's quite a difference. And later, TV days with the Cubs, it was more, he was the part of the show, and the things he would say and the way he would describe it, maybe miss a play here or there or get behind, but that was all part of why fans loved him so much.
You are of the company, and I'm in this group as well, that I know I've read you've said you don't need a home run call. That's not something that you'd ever really thought about. I know you'd tried a couple things that didn't necessarily work, but then you wound up with Bye-Bye Baseball. How did that come to be, and why did that wind up working?
Well, my first, I did some games in rookie ball in Helena with the Pioneer League team, and I didn't really have a home run call then, but then when I got real serious about it and decided to make a career change, and because I worked for the radio station and did sales and eventually a general manager, but my true love again was baseball, and I thought, you know what, if I don't, this was going back to the mid to late 80s, thought, I got to get into baseball, and like all broadcasters, you're always thinking I want to get to the big leagues, so I started looking for jobs in minor league baseball, and my first full-time minor league job was in Midland at that time it was the Angels, the Midland Angels in the Texas League, Double-A, and I just thought, you know what, I should come up with a home run call, and so I had the home run call was, to tie it in with the Angels, was Fly Away to Home Run Heaven, and then when I came here to Des Moines after a couple of years in Midland, I didn't really have one, and I guess I don't really recall how I came up with Bye-Bye Baseball. I think somebody had a similar call in the big leagues, and I tried to adapt it and I don't recall who that was or when that was, but it was Goodbye Baseball. Maybe if somebody had Goodbye Baseball, and I thought, that sounds pretty good. So, and with Bye-Bye, you can kind of say it a couple of times, Bye-Bye, Bye-Bye Baseball, and so I decided to go with that. I thought having a home run call, I think, is is a good idea just to try to come up with some terms that people associate with your broadcast.
Wanted to ask you about a couple of guys that you had the chance to see in your career, if I can take you back, and just kind of do a quick association with some people you've crossed paths with, because that always intrigues me at the minor league level. If I can go back to when you first, I think it was when you first started in Iowa. It might have been before one of your previous stops. What do you remember about Turk Wendell?
Turk was quite the character. What I remember about him is, all his eccentricities, where we had, supposedly it's the original building. It's a very small little structure. It's almost like one of these mini homes now, except not even that big, but it's very close to the ballpark. In fact, just outside the ballpark, the original building in Des Moines when it was established way back in the 1800s. So they preserved that building, and I remember Turk saying he wished he could live in that building because there was that, and he would show up with the chain around his neck, not a chain, but the necklace that had bear's teeth on it. They're just these different, and he'd talk about some of the hunting expeditions he'd been on or hoped to go on, and yeah, he was quite the character. But then on the field, he was a good teammate. But also on the field, he was just such a good competitor. You could tell he loved the game and going out there and helping his team win. And of course, jumping over the line, headed out from the dugout to the pitching mound, he'd kind of take a hop skip over the mound and brushing his teeth between innings and chewing on licorice. And he was one of the more, I guess eccentric would be the word, but more interesting people we've had here as far as personality. There's been so many. Rod Beck was such a nice guy when he was here, trying to get back to the big leagues. And he even lived in a motor home. He parked it out by where the grounds crew is and lived out there. And fans were welcome to stop in and talk to him after a night game or have a beer or two. And boy, he was a memorable guy. And there's so many. Kerry Wood was another one that he played here on and off so many years. He was here, coming up when he was 19 and 20 as a phenom on his way to Chicago. But then he'd come back probably four other seasons on rehab. But he was always such a nice guy and easy to talk to. And it was fun to watch him, too, as from a 19, 20-year-old who was a little on the shy side and didn't say too much to become more of a veteran pitcher and a leader, I think, for the Chicago Cubs, to see that growth in him as a person when he come back on rehab, and was always cordial and happy to see not only myself but other people that he knew from when he played here as a young guy in Des Moines. He always seemed to appreciate the fans coming out to support him too.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask was about Rod Beck's RV trailer. Did you ever get a chance to hang out there when he was in town?
I think I went out there once, but again, it was he enjoyed living out there, and he had a fun time. He made the best of the situation. As you said, guys sometimes come down to the minor leagues and they don't like it. How soon am I going to get out of here? But he seemed to enjoy it, and he was another guy that's just a great competitor. Loved to get out there and pitch, and he was only throwing in the mid 80s to maybe 87, 88 at times. He didn't have much stuff left, but man, he would somehow get people out just with location and the guile that he had out there. And so he seemed to love what he was doing, and of course did get back to the big leagues for a brief time. But that was an interesting time.
How about Doug Glanville? Do you remember the most intellectual conversation you had with Doug Glanville when he was around? Was he still that kind of headsy guy back then?
He was, but I guess I kept it more on the baseball side. What I remember about Doug is he was a hard worker. That he worked a lot. At that time, one of the more notable characters that I got to know because he'd sit in with me on the broadcast whenever he came to town was Jimmy Pearsall, was the Chicago Cubs outfielder instructor. So he was there probably 4 or 5 times during the year. But I think Doug was just an excellent student with Pearsall to improve his outfield play, and even working with our coaching staff and the manager about becoming a better hitter. And I think he just showed how smart he was by being able to adapt and get better year by year and take his natural talent and improve on that to get to the big leagues, and then the toughest part is the staying, and he was able to do that. He had a very nice career up there.
I want to ask you about one guy that was not on your team, but I have to imagine you saw him on an opposing team in 1988 and 1989. We're going to go way back. What was a minor league Sammy Sosa like to see and to broadcast?
I don't think I had him in the Texas League, but he joined us on rehab 1 year. And in fact, kind of an odd story is we were in Indianapolis at Old Busch Stadium, and Sammy was going to the batting cage, except we had this torrential rain, a big downpour, and I was going back to the clubhouse in the locker room, and somehow we kind of got trapped together in this little walkway where part of it flooded, so we couldn't go either way. And I remember that more than anything, just, having a nice talk for 5 or 10 minutes until I think the rain or whatever subsided, or somehow we got back in the clubhouse. But he was only here for 2-3 games on rehab. But again, he was very nice. But I just remember that little conversation we had. Of course, he was just excited to be able to hit again and want to get healthy and go back and help Chicago. And it was all about helping his team up there.
I want to ask about your path in the minor leagues, too, and that stop in the Texas League, because I know that was kind of a leap of faith for you. And I know there are a lot of broadcasters that wonder if that's, you get stuck in one spot and you go, hey, should I take that jump? Should I take that leap of faith? What was it like? Do you remember the decision process you had to go through to say, you know what, I'm going to upend myself? I think you were in your early 30s at that point, and move to Texas to do this thing that hopefully gives me that shot to get to the next level that I want to reach?
Yeah, that was the biggest decision that really I had to make in my life. And of course, when I say that involves at that time, my wife, and we had, of course, our children are grown now. We're still together, by the way, my wife and I, but that was a tough one. We had 4 children that, we had to move. My parents were older, in their late 60s to about 70 at the time, and they were only an hour and a half away. Her parents were a few more hours away, but they also lived in Montana. We were in Helena at the time, and I just thought that I have to do this. If I'm at all serious about this goal of trying to get to the big leagues, I've got to do this now to get into baseball full time. And so it was a tough one. Minor league baseball, especially at that time, didn't pay too well, and it was quite a jolt for our family. But the good news is it worked out well. We really enjoyed living in Midland for a couple of years, worked with some nice people down there. Bill Davidson, the Texas League was a fun league. My wife, through the years, while we were married in our early years, had done some schooling, and she continued that down in Texas. She'd been a stay-at-home mom until we got to Texas, and financially she had to go to work, but she got into work for Texaco down there part-time, and then they hired her full-time, and she kept on the side getting some of her schoolwork done, so she's ended up doing pretty well in the insurance business and had a nice career. And again, it was a tough decision, and maybe looking at it financially, probably one we shouldn't have done, but it worked out okay. So it was like I said up front, it was probably the toughest decision that I had to make in my life.
If I can bring it full circle, as you've gone through your entire career, the first question I asked you was about what keeps you coming back game in and game out. But I'm curious how you keep things fresh for yourself as well. And obviously the game itself comes differently every night. The players are different from year to year. You mentioned that. But how you maybe approach things, or how you tweak things, or what you've done differently through the years that has made each and every night and each and every year a little bit different and a new adventure for you that has kept the business fresh for 40 years?
I think what's really helped me is for a number of years, I always had a partner, and a couple of guys eventually getting to the big leagues, Dave Raymond and Brett Dolan, I worked with going back probably 15 years or so. And so that those two guys, Randy Wayhofer worked with Randy for 8 or 9 years, and now he's the number one guy now. I'm just kind of the part-time guy, do the middle innings and try to do color with Alex Cohen, the number one guy now for the I-Cubs. But I think that's made a huge difference for me, just being able to work with a broadcast partner and some of the guys in our league that have been doing it a long time, that pretty much are solo other than maybe having a partner at home. I really admire them because I just think it makes for a better broadcast. I go back to that comment I made about we're competing with the big leagues, and every big league broadcast, there's at least two guys that they have, probably more. But if you can, as close as you can come to have a big league sound, the better off you're going to be for maybe gaining new listeners or keeping the listeners you have to compete with those major league teams. But for me, that's having a good partner where both guys sound good on play-by-play, but also you have that chemistry where you can work well together and talk about the game, or again, maybe talk about some things happening around town or off the field just to make it interesting, or baseball history. And of course, with the more eyes you have, the more you'll see. Just one guy, you're going to miss some things here and there for whatever reason, but if there's a couple of people, then you're going to see more. So for me, that's really made a big difference the last 15 years or so. It's just being able to work with somebody and just having a good time with a partnership on the air.
Well, and I have to imagine you relished and have relished the opportunity to be able to work with some of those younger guys too, and be a little bit of a mentor for them and make that kind of impact in their lives.
Yeah, hopefully that's the case, and you'd have to get their opinions, but I hopefully that's the case where it's helped them to move on and do bigger and better things. And Dave's back in the big leagues now with Texas, and I think doing pretty well there. And Alex has the ability where I could see him as a big league broadcaster one day. But having said that, it's tougher. It's easier said than done, just because there aren't many jobs that open up there, and there's so many qualified broadcasters. I think about the guys around our league that are so good in AAA in general and minor league baseball in general, not just AAA, but A-ball guys, AA guys anymore are just so good, but it's hard to move up. And I think looking back, I'm just thankful that I've had 30 years here in AAA, and these jobs are so precious. And I can't forget to not mention our organization. Just Sam Burnaby's the guy that hired me. He's still the owner or part owner and team president and general manager for the team, the Iowa Cubs, and he's just been really good to me. And just working for the organization has helped too, where they kind of let you do your job and help you any way they can, and there's no pressure about you forgot to do this or that, and that's been a big part of it too. I think I've been able to last 30 seasons here in AAA, and overall I have to add them up, but I guess it's probably 40 or so that I've been doing minor league baseball, and the first few years more of a part-time deal in Helena. But yeah, 32 years total. It was kind of the full-time job was between AA and AAA.
Deane, if people want to find you on social media, or if they want to catch an iCubs game, how do they track you down?
On the internet, iowacubs.com, you can go and just navigate through the website to listen, which is pretty easy anymore with the internet. That's made a big difference in broadcasting too in recent years, where man, it's just so cool to be able to have family from the team's family. I'm speaking of parents and cousins and relatives of the players that get to tune in and follow them, or this day and age with even video, MILB.TV, where they can watch and listen. So that's probably the easiest thing. I'm not a real big guy on like Twitter and some of the social media, but on the website they can listen in, and I think my email is still listed on there. And I do have a Twitter handle, Deane Ehlis, but of course that's another thing I have to overcome, is the spelling of my names are both a little different than what you think. So I think people would try to reach out for me, and that's where I haven't been real proactive in trying to push my Twitter to send me comments or whatnot, just because I don't want to go through reminding people how to spell my name, because it's not
Somewhere there's
It's an easy name to remember, Deane Ehlis, but they're both spelled a little different.
Somewhere there's a poor guy, DeaneEllis, who cannot figure out why he keeps getting tweets about the Iowa Cubs.
Yeah, exactly.
He's just trying to be a money manager in Texas, and he can't figure it out.
Yeah, probably about 50 guys like that, which is fine with me. I learned early on that it was nice to have a different name because I think they called my house when I was a teenager trying to collect some money from Deane Ehlis, and my mom or dad said, "How do you spell that?" And they, have the correct spelling, D-E-A-R, the normal spelling, D-E-A-N and E-L-L-I-S. And, well, no, that's not us. We spell our name this way. So it's, I guess, made me distinctive at least one way.
That Deane lives down the street.
All right, that is Deane Ehlis joining us here on PXPcast. Next week, our guest is the voice of the Amarillo Sod Poodles. He's the only one they've ever had. They're like 40 games into the season and their existence. Sam Levitt will join us. He is one of the most well-known young, up-and-coming voices in minor league baseball. But I wanted to talk to him because he's also extremely creative in the way he covers his team, not just on a nightly broadcast sense, but the media around his team. So we'll have an interesting conversation about all of that, and I'm sure we'll talk about his in-game dancing as well. Sam Levitt joins us next week. Many thanks to Deane Ehlis, though, for joining us here on the pod this week. Until next week, we're on a 7-day break. My name's Joel Gadet. The music is Marshmallow, and we are out.
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.